Hello and welcome to another episode of the Next Iteration podcast. This is Channs and Chirag, your hosts for today, and we want to talk about pitfalls relating to testing strategy and how you can avoid them in today's episode. So, like we've been talking in the last few episodes, in today's fast-paced development environment where businesses expect development teams, software teams to be able to churn out new features and put them into production quite frequently, every week, every other week, and so on. It is really crucial to have a solid testing strategy. But as teams start to implement that, there are several pitfalls that they can encounter along the way, and it's our aim to share our perspective of what those pitfalls are with you today, and how you can avoid them, and in order to build a more effective and reliable test strategy for yourself. So why don't you get started, Chance, and share the first one on the list?
Yeah, Chirag. I think the first one, many software teams would be grappling with this one. It's over relying on manual testing. As we all know and agree, manual testing is slow, it's error prone, it is subjective, and it's not repeatable. And which person loves to stay back on a Friday night after a big deployment to verify all the flows? And as your system becomes more complex and also bigger in size, it's tough to keep up. If your test suite primarily comprises of manual tests, it's one difficult to keep up in terms of how many flows can you test, and also it takes quite a lot of time. Uh, I think a couple of tips to avoid this. One is focus on test automation, which is the most obvious answer, and especially tests that are very repetitive, and also regression kind of tests, because these give you the most value right away. And don't view it with one kind of lens. I'll probably wait for us to get through all the other pitfalls as well, so we can uncover these tips associated with this. Secondly, there is a place for manual testing. I'm not saying fully remove manual testing. Reserve it for exploratory purposes, because human beings are good in certain kind of tasks, while machines can automate the other tasks. There could be some edge cases, or there could be some creative way of testing that can only be done via manual testing.
All right. So next, I want to cover slow tests. A test
Hmm.
suite that runs painfully slowly, and also a test suite that has flaky tests. So slow and flaky tests is the other pitfall to avoid. And yeah, it's far too common for teams to start off with a decent bunch of tests in the first couple of months, but by the time they hit the third month and fifth month of development, they start to reach a point where their test suites, test runs are becoming extremely long,
Hmm.
and now it's taking hours to finish, and then they're also seeing these couple of tests which just sometimes seem to fail, and it just magically when you run it again, it seems to pass again, and now it'll pass for the next three times and then fail again the fourth time, even with no other changes being made in the system. And so those kinds of flaky tests, and slow tests, both of these together, what they do then is decrease developer confidence in your
Hmm.
test suite, and then tests start to get ignored, and start to then starts stop serving their purpose. And so the way to avoid this is to make sure that you keep optimizing your test suite for speed, to make sure that when you're writing unit tests, you're not bringing in any unnecessary dependencies. When you're writing integration tests, again, you're only depending on things that you really ought to depend on, and also choosing the right kind of tests that optimize for speed and for localization, right? So when a unit test can do a job, don't use an integration test. And when an integration test can do a job, don't go in for a functional test, and
Hmm.
or an end-to-end test. So run right the choose the right level of test and default to the lowest level that will do the job, This will do two things because your test will be easier to write and easier to change in the future, but also they'll be faster to run. And then in case of a flaky test, a flaky test, I believe is more important than fixing broken, code in your, in the system. Like a flaky test needs to be dealt with immediately, and people need to prioritize that over anything else.
The next one would be lack of developer ownership in testing. If developers don't take responsibility for writing tests, and I think you spoke about some of them now, Chirag, it would generally be unit integration and contract. Like the testing load and the feedback loop becomes the primary responsibility of the QA. And QAs generally focus on domain oriented or like user oriented tests, and they are primarily looking into, let's say, end to end tests, or they may look at fat integration tests. So the side effects would be, one is it is unreasonable to expect one role or one part of the team to own the entire testing landscape, and they would become the bottleneck. And also you will depend overly on one kind of test, and again that's not efficient. It could be slow and then unreliable, and maybe you again go back to manual testing, right? And I think these are the sort of impact, and then and then the side effects of like if developers don't own the testing, and it could lead to longer feedback loops and higher defect rates as well. A couple of tips to avoid this: one is you need to bring in engineering culture where developers are clear and responsible for writing tests, especially unit integration and contract. So like these are guidelines. I'm not saying these are the only tests that they should write. They could write more based on your domain and context. They may even pair with QAs to on things like end-to-end tests as well. Uh, and one other important part is to ensure that this testing, both for developers and QAs, is done in the same iteration or sprint, and it becomes a definition of done as part of every user story.
Right. So I want to talk about an associated pitfall that, with this idea that developers should be writing tests and should be responsible for writing tests. Some teams, or actually quite a few teams in my experience, end up uh, then overemphasizing on code coverage with the developers, right? So they either set unreasonable targets like 100% code coverage,
Yeah.
or even if they set a reasonable target like 80% code coverage, but for a team that doesn't have enough experience, where the developers don't have enough experience of writing, doing test driven development and writing good unit tests, such sort of ambitious targets around code coverage can do more harm than good. Because what it does is that the development team starts to, most likely they'll start to game the system. If they are
Mhm.
prevented from checking in because of low code coverage, they'll write whatever tests it takes to get the code coverage high, and then the focus is not on the quality of tests and what it is achieving and um, what it is preventing from sort of creeping into the system, but rather it is the focus shifts on making sure that the test is bumping up the code coverage number. And you might sort of find this funny or scary, whichever way you've looked at it, but I've looked through code bases which have tests with 100 lines of code, but
Mhm.
no assertions in them at all. And
Yeah.
one of the, in one of the code bases I was reading, it must be a test written by a very sincere developer who was kind enough to also write a comment that went, this test has been added to increase code coverage. And I feel so sad that somehow then the poor developer just did not get, from anybody on the team, the right understanding of what they are trying to do,
Mm.
and why they are trying to write tests in the first place. So don't fall into the trap of overemphasizing on code coverage, and instead treat code coverage as a guideline rather than a hard goal, and focus on helping each developer understand the value of developer tests for their own productivity and for their own efficiency as developers, and encourage them to write good tests, teach them how to write good tests, get some
mm,
coaches in if needed, and uh, create the right environment where people can learn from each other and from others in the organization who are good at writing good developer tests. So invest in that rather than believing that this kind of forcing function will automatically get people to do the right thing. It will only get people to figure out ways to meet that bar. And that bar doesn't say anything about how good the tests are. You can only check that there are tests when you are checking for code coverage. So be very
mm.
careful with overemphasis on code coverage.
Very relatable point, Chirag, and then well articulated as well. Maybe one more point to add from my side. This is ignoring what are called cross-functional tests. Some teams call these as non-functional tests as well. As the name says, you don't associate these tests with a button or API or data that you can see. They would be cross-cutting concerns in terms of availability, security, performance, accessibility, and so on. And generally, anything compare with which is connected with regulatory compliance could be the PCI card standard, could be accessibility standards, could be healthcare standards are also associated with these. Now, the pitfall would be that teams often ignore these tests because they're focusing on functional tests. Like in the earlier point I had mentioned about developers not owning tests, maybe now developers and QAs are unable to focus on these because their focus is on functional tests, or maybe their business stakeholders are not aligned to fund these, let's say, these cross-functional tests. So what would happen now? Um, all the Because there could be functional tests already, the system could relatively work fine on the developer's machine, on the QA's machine, or even in controlled environments. But once the system goes live to production, and there are hundreds or thousands or a lot more users accessing your system, like in real-time scenarios where there would be network delays, there are like geographical boundaries, there are other ISP hops and so on, the system fails, and not because your functionality is incorrect, because you have failed to taken care of the cross-functional requirements. And especially this affects teams a lot in industries with very strict regulations, because there is very little that you can do to go back or bring it in at the last minute. So how to avoid these? Like I just now spoke about it, incorporate cor- so like so incorporate a cross-functional test as part of your test strategy as early as possible, and then preferably from day one. The second thing is similar to not depending on manual testing for functional tests. Automate your cross-functional tests as much as you can. There are a variety and like plethora of good tools that can automate these tests for you. And once you automate them, yeah, don't neglect them. Make them like part of your CI/CD pipeline as
All right. So the next one that I want to cover is poor test data management. So
well.
many teams fall into this trap of not quite knowing how to manage their test data. And there are two aspects to this. That one, they could fail to create a way in which developers and testers who are writing a new test in the ecosystem,
Mm,
creating an easy way for them to get the test data set up for their test with ease. So that kind of investment, if it's not made, then writing every new test can feel like a very big task, especially when it comes to integration tests or when it comes to functional end-to-end tests. So that's one kind of thing that teams can get wrong. The other is the boundary between production data and test data. So teams can make the mistake sometimes in the hope for getting more interesting scenarios. Teams can make the mistake of pulling real production data into the test environments and using that to test, which can lead to all kinds of all kinds of issues around data protection and compliance and so on. And so, make sure that right from the beginning you set up automated test data generation and management, mechanisms in your test code base, and ensure that people can use that with ease. And the other thing about test, production data is even if you wanted to get some ideas for what kind of patterns are there in production data that you want to bring in into your test scenarios, anonymize that data and do that really well before you use that as before you use any production data as test data. So those are our thoughts about the key pitfalls that teams need to look for and avoid when they are implementing automated tests. And so I'll go over them again just to sum up. Um, so watch out for over reliance on manual testing. Watch out for slow and unreliable tests. Watch out for lack of developer involvement in testing. Watch out for overemphasis of on code coverage. Be very careful about ignoring functional tests and forgetting about them when it comes to your testing strategy, and make sure that you don't fall into the trap of having poor test data management. And for those who are listening in and have are with us, I would encourage you to go back and sit together with your teams and revisit your test suite and your test strategy to check if you have any of these symptoms in your test ecosystem, and then try and fix that, because that will allow you to get set up for long-term success. So that's it from me and Chance then. Thanks for tuning in. Bye bye.